All right, everybody, welcome very much to the webinar we have going on. So basically what we find is there's always a lot of misconceptions that seem to happen around whenever people first start. And I think a lot of that comes from, you'll hop on an internet group or forum and you'll get one person's experience and slice of it, which, depending on their personality type, it could be great advice, or it could be something that may lead you down the wrong way. And so what we found at Bootstrap Farmers, whenever anybody calls and actually talks to the tech line, because we visit so many farms, that there's just this inherent hive mind and mindset that we've seen so much volume of hoop houses out in the world and have talked to so many people that by the time they get done talking to the tech line, that they just feel so much better. And once we follow up after the build and things like that, then it's almost never as hard as what they thought it was going to be. So we wanted to just cover some things that we see over and over again and just kind of alleviate some of those stresses that you may have if this is your first round about looking into hoop houses for your farm. So my name is Nick. I've been with the company since 2018. I've been in and around greenhouses and the plant industry since 1997. So I've been to farms in 43 states. I've seen a lot of hoop houses. I've talked to a lot of farmers. And Julian is our R&D and tech line supervisor. He answers a lot of questions every single week. He'll be running the chat box. So if you have any questions along the way, please feel free to answer. I'm going to respect everybody's time. There's no way I can cover everything I'd possibly want to tell you in 45 minutes to an hour. So I'm going to allow a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. But Julian's a great resource. He's been instrumental in helping us develop the hoop houses and many of the products that you see at Bootstrap Farmer. The goal of this webinar, again, is to just cover the misconceptions that we see over and over again, hopefully eliminate any worry that you may have. We're going to think about visualizing what you may need, how you're going to use it, and consider your budget. And then anybody that's looking for a hoop house as an investment, we just want to introduce some of these concepts that you may miss along the way. And then again, this is going to be a very fast hour, but it's only the beginning. So at the end of this, if you have some questions to write down that we weren't able to get to, we answer the phones basically 7 days a week. So we're going to talk about how professional farmers, and that is another thing about this webinar, is we're not really talking to the home gardener. This is for people that are looking to make either a side hustle or a main income or a part of your income from a hoop house or a farm situation. So we're going to look at how professional farmers that do this every single day for a living, how they use it all 4 seasons. We're going to talk about hoop houses in a storm, and we're going to look specifically at wind, specifically at snow. There's going to be a little overlap between those 3 concepts, but it's something you almost need to hear twice because it's so much concern. We're going to take a look at how to keep things cool in the summer and how farmers grow in the heat. We're going to take a look at how to keep things warm and how to grow in the winter, sizing your hoop houses, how to get an apples to apple bid. One of the best things that we would like for you to do is go ahead and get multiple bids, talk to other companies, get back with us and see if we're not the best fit. We would like to know, but we really think that given all of the options that we have and all the sizes and all of the expertise we have going into this, that we would be your choice. We're going to talk a little bit about the installation process, and then at the end we're going to talk about how to save money when purchasing your hoop house. So let's cover what a hoop house is, because that's one of the main misconceptions people seem to have. For your farm, we like to think that this is the foundation in which you can really tailor this to your own needs. We're not really going to be talking about what you'll see in the top left slide, which is a highly engineered greenhouse for a very specific crop. We're talking big money farms here. I don't think anybody at this webinar is going to cover that, and that's not what we do at this company. We also don't have like home grade, Costco or anything like that kits. We don't have any super fancy kits. I was a former farmer myself. I designed the hoop houses in the very beginning before Julian came on, and then he's just added to it. And so these are purpose-built for farmers and for serious hobbyists that are actually growing for a profit every single day. There's going to be a little bit of overlap. We do have a caterpillar tunnel. Sometimes you'll hear it as a cat tunnel. And a lot of these are going to be interchangeable, but we'll kind of talk a little bit about that on the way. But that's mainly what we're talking about here is the hoop house, very simple structures, highly optimized or not optioned at all. There's round versions, which is like a half semicircle. There's also a Gothic. And the main thing to consider there is the Gothic, people really like that for snow loads. But we also see a lot of southern growers use that mainly because they like the looks of it. They like a little bit of extra headroom, and they like to go with that. And this all boils down to everything that we're going to talk about in this webinar is going to come down. This is your hoop house. This is your farm. This is your operation. There's no set, like you have to do anything one single way other than kind of keep it within the specifications in the install manual. But this is your choice. We're just here to give you all the options that you have either on this webinar or after the fact. So there's also the Caterpillar tunnel, which we talked about a second ago, and we're going to get into more detail. And then a lot of people are super curious about the bracing options. So that's kind of the main structures that we're going to be talking about. We're also going to cover things like shade cloth, different ventilation techniques, and trellising. And I put that last slide on there. This is a very recent build here in North Texas in which this guy had lights. And one of the questions Julian and the tech team gets over and over again is, can I do X, Y, or Z? And almost always the answer is yes, or with enough money. And then it also comes down to, but do you need to do something? I think a lot of times people will see a hoop house on TV or a bigger grower and think that they have to have that. And more often than not, Bootstrap Farmer Tech team is likely to talk you into something you're not going to need in your operation after they ask you about what you plan to do and how you plan to grow. So can you customize? It's almost endless the things you can do, and we've seen some very creative things out in the field that people just want to do for looks, or they may do for a very specific crop, but almost always the answer is yes. You just have to make sure that juice is kind of worth the squeeze. How do professional growers grow in 4 seasons? And I really like to add that 4 seasons part on there, because if we're talking about growing for our local community or for our family, people need to eat year-round, and we're going to get into some of those ways that people do that. So I want you to think seasonally. I want you to be aware that a hoop house is basically going to give you 2 zones lower than where you're currently at. You can take a look at the USDA map and find your area and see kind of what your growing zone is. And as you're doing your seed selection, crop planning, planning for your market, you can almost guarantee that 2 zones quicker, that means you're bringing product to market faster. You're almost always going to have better looking fruit or leafy vegetables or herbs or flowers. And you're going to be able to do it earlier than people without a hoop house and continue to grow later unless you do a crop switch out. You're also protecting against the wind, and that's a big one for everybody that calls, thinks that they live in the windiest part of the country, and we hear you, and that's certainly a concern for most people. But protecting your plants, protecting that vegetation, and giving your employees and yourself a nice place to work away from the wind is a big part of that seasonal farming. And it's counterintuitive that, hey, we're going to keep the wind out of this tunnel, because you would think, hey, rain helps the plants grow. But just know that you're controlling all of the irrigation and the watering from inside the hoop house with very precise irrigation. So you're not having to tromp around in the mud. You're not drowning your plants. You're giving the roots room to grow without being oversaturated. So keeping that wind off, especially, we're in North Texas, and so we deal with a lot of Texas farmers. They're our dear friends, and we've just gotten really hit hard this season with a lot of rain, as well as a lot of other people in the country. So having proper drainage, having something to shed that rain off and take it away from the plants so you can properly irrigate is a huge, huge part of this. And really, the longer I go and the more I do this and the more erratic the weather becomes, the more important I think that becomes. We're also keeping snow off of the plants, and this is very important for leafy vegetables that you're taking to market. They're not getting frostburn and things like that. So just basically tucking in your plants in the night or during the day during a bad storm, that's what we're looking to do. The other thing is we're wanting to think local, as in your market and their preferences is largely going to be dictated. If they're locavores and they're used to eating local and it's important to them, you don't want to get, and some people have proved me wrong on this, but you don't want to get too far outside of the normal stuff that's in a grocery store. And if we look at grocery stores and look at what they provide, there's a reason that they select what they have in there. So growing something familiar, but that's fresher, maybe a little bit of variety difference is going to be a big part of that 4-season farming. You don't want to give them something that they're not going to buy or that your family's not going to eat. So paying attention to those buyer preferences and doing something in a hoop house that was purpose designed for people doing this where you don't have to worry about your structure. We want you to put something up and not have to worry about, hey, is this thing going to blow away? Do we have the proper foundation? And I always like to talk about, there's a video on YouTube that somebody, I believe it's in Nebraska, is growing or had grown in the past. It's a super old video that they're growing citrus trees, in the wintertime in the Midwest. While it's possible, I want you to really think about from a hobby aspect, we're taking produce to market. Is that the best use of the very valuable real estate that you have inside of your hoop house? So we go back to, can I customize? Well, can I grow this? Likely yes. Does it make sense? That's one of those personal preferences that you may want to consider if you're doing this for profit. We want to think about your crop selection, and most of the things that we're going to talk about here are going to come down to crop selection. We can put all the fans and heaters and shade cloth in here in the world, but if we have an out-of-season crop inside of that hoop house, it's almost never going to work. Giving yourself the grace to learn how to grow, especially undercover for the first time, the first year. I always consistently see that people start growing in a high tunnel. Their spacing's a little off the first year. You're getting that learning curve down. Usually they're doubling the yield the second year. Third year, they're adding another 30%. And 4, 5, and 6 years in, they're really dialing in the systems and maximizing every square inch of that space. They're doing trials of very similar crops but different varieties to maximize the space inside of there. So give yourself a year or two to get this done. You're going to notice drastic results year one, but you're just going to be floored by what happens in year two. We have a lot of pictures in here is from Paris Natural Farms just south of us. They have a hoop house that is just for propagation. So dedicating a little part or a significant part, depending on your operation, just to propagation is another way to maximize some of that square footage inside of your hoop house. If you're buying seeds from some of the bigger places that specialize in market growers, they're going to have specific greenhouse varieties. These are not GMOs. These have been bred over years. We have a video on YouTube that specifically talks about breeding process and how these crops come to light. But just know that some of the crops that you may choose may do far better outside or inside, depending on what that is, and that's something to look towards. There's a lot of stuff that you have to learn your first year, but that's one I think a lot of people miss, is knowing that there is a greenhouse variety. I also want you to think about indoor versus outdoor crops, and the best, for instance, I can give you is some people grow cabbage inside of a hoop house. Nothing wrong with that, but the amount of space that a head of cabbage takes up versus the harvestable head, you can get 4, 5, 6 heads of lettuce at a quicker turn that you're able to sell for a higher profit value. So thinking about, should I put something that's very cold hardy and it takes up a lot of room in one of my outdoor beds versus maximizing every square inch inside of that hoop house for profit, that's something that you'll want to also consider. I also want you to think about the notion of microclimates and just different options that you can do inside of your hoop house. So typically, when people think of frost blanket, they'll think about using that outside crop to keep the frost off. But putting a frost blanket inside of a hoop house, even if you layer different layers of it up together, you're basically tucking in those plants at night, giving them a few extra degrees of protection. And you'll notice in almost all of these pictures, except for one, that there's not a heater, because we are talking about proper plant selection, different times of the year. We're rotating those crops in and out to have that seasonal type of vegetable. So a little bit of protection here and there is great, especially if you know a heavy frost or heavy storm or heavy winds are coming. But more often than not, I've been with Bootstrap, again, 7, 8 years at this point. And I think we've only sold 2 heaters that somebody absolutely just had to have. So know that the vast majority of the farmers that use Bootstrap Farmer, they're growing seasonally without the use of heat, propane, all that stuff. Also, proper irrigation techniques. I find that seems to be quite an afterthought when people are putting in their foundation and their infrastructure within the hoop house, and that incorporating that in the beginning and having a plan in place is going to help you whenever you plant your transplants, so you're not having to catch up with what they're having to go through. So again, things like roll-up sides and fans, which we'll get into a little bit more in the webinar, is going to give you options to bring in fresh air, circulate, and keep that humidity down all at the same time. So the takeaways from that first section is we're going to gain 2 seasons. We're thinking about growing your crops for longer and earlier into the season. We want to block the wind, reduce the flooding. We want to really take a look at crop selection. And this is a great time. If you're thinking about a hoop house now, that means you got a few months to build it before next season. That means you also have a few months to get with your seed reps, talk to your other local farmers, talk to the people, your potential buyers at the market, and really see what that crop selection needs to be. Keep in mind that these hoop houses are highly customizable and they're very economical foundations for your needs. Number two, probably the biggest question that we get and the one that causes the most amount of worry is, can they survive in the storm? This is a farm just north of Austin. They got hit by a significant wind event. This is not one of our hoop houses, just so we're clear. This is a home-built version. They also did not use any ground post prior to this event. I think they had 7 hoop houses, and 5 of the 7 were just completely destroyed. So you can take a look at this is all from the same farm. The big hoop house that you see on the left in the bottom right picture is a very significant, hardcore, like very, very professional industrial hoop house, and it looks like a giant just set on it. You can kind of see that divot in the shade cloth in the picture above it, and right next to it is one of our 20-foot by I think 65 foot, I can't remember exactly, but that is one of our all-metal kits on the right. Didn't have a scratch on it, and all the other Caterpillar tunnels that they had. One of the things that Julian pointed out long ago that I've always taken to heart was you're more at risk with the debris flying about in a wind event. So think about shingles or patio furniture or just debris that you have laying around your farm. We all have it. That's more likely to poke a hole and cause damage in the actual plastic than any wind is going to do. We've had some severe tornadic events around Paris, Texas, where we're at. We have several hoop houses around here on farms, and we haven't had any issues whatsoever. And that's not to say that a direct hit from a tornado wouldn't cause damage, but I can sit here and tell you that we've never lost a hoop house, knock on wood, to a direct tornado hit. It also has to go down to the site prep, meaning your soil structure and your drainage. So if you have super sandy soil with a lot of debris, a lot of rocks in it that's a little loose, you may consider contacting tech and have them work through some of those solutions. But the main thing for me is keeping the water away from the hoop house so it doesn't pool, it doesn't saturate, no matter what the soil structure is. That way when you have those wind loads, that the soil is nice, dry, compact, without giving you that much room to move around from the ground post side of things. I'll talk a little bit about structural engineering. That comes up quite a bit, especially for new people, and they're having to deal with like a municipality, like a university or an industrial setting. Every state would require its own structural engineering stamp, and that stamp is only good for a year. It's a very expensive process. The number of times we've actually had to do that is like 2 or 3, and that was something that is actually the responsibility of the farmer. So given that most of these structures are in a rural setting, they don't have to have any of these specs or regulations. There's no reason for Bootstrap Farmer to get 50 different states and have to charge you guys for it whenever so few people actually need it. The other thing to remember is each individual plot of land is likely to have a different soil structure. We spent a lot of time with structural engineers in the design of this in the beginning, and the difference between one side of town versus the other across the board is pretty significant. So it's just a crazy expense that we're not going to do to pass on to you. Now, we did get some stamps in the beginning to make sure that our structures were up to spec and that we met that 101 mile an hour kind of load for wind that we had in the very beginning. If you call and looking for that, we're not going to have it, and neither is anybody else. So just keep that in mind that likely that's not something you're going to need. Ground post, to me, is going to be the most significant thing that you need to think about whenever if you're worried about storms. The hoops are less likely to bend. If a hoop house is liable to have an issue, it's going to be where the hoop meets the ground post and where the ground post meets the ground. The ground posts are bigger than the hoops. They're drove in 2 foot above. If you have concerns, again, the tech team will be happy to work through that. Keeping the plastic tight is probably the most significant thing that you can do to help that wind just airfoil over the hoop house and not pool and cause damage. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, my first or second year of farming, I did a home-built hoop house. I got lazy. I had a hole in my gable. We had a wind event. I had 2 hoop houses right next to the other. The one I was lazy and didn't fix got rolled up like a ball and thrown out into the highway several hundred yards away. And that wind getting inside of the hoop house, picking it up like a parasail, that's what you want to try to avoid. We can also look at inflation fans. Depending on who you talk to, we're going to ask you a lot of questions if you're looking into that. It is an expense that you may find worth it. If you're heating a hoop house, I would for sure do it. It's just going to give you a couple of degrees of protection, but if you're spending money to heat a hoop house, you're going to want to get all the insulation benefits that you can. But the other thing that it'll do, if you are truly in a high wind environment, inflating that second layer does give you a little bit of rigidity to bounce off that wind. And then the other picture on the right, and then the far picture on the right, the more vertical picture, kind of shows you an example of some of our trusses and horizontal bars. And I like the picture on the very far right because it does, this is another hoop house just south of us a couple hours away that was built inside of a tree grove. So they had a lot of wind protection, but this guy kind of went all out. And again, did he have to do that? Probably not, but he wanted to. It's his choice, personal preference. Look, we're going to talk a little bit about wind loads. Again, this is a recent build. You can see those straps on the second hoop from the right, and then a couple more hoops on. It kind of forms an X. That's something called batten strapping. And although it's highly possible to get that plastic very, very tight, the batten strapping kind of helps suck that plastic in a little bit and give you a little bit of extra wind protection. We have a video on how to install that, just recently put it out. Again, if we're talking about wind loads, and I know that we're going to repeat a couple of things during this section, but the ground post, very, very critical, keeping that plastic tight, repairing the holes as you go. And it's always good to have a little bit of repair tape on hand. There's always going to be a little hole. You're going to do some maintenance around the high tunnel. You're going to throw a rock with a weed eater or whatever. It's not a big deal. Maybe if you have a big hole or something like that, call the tech team, get some advice, send some pictures in. But it's usually a pretty quick repair and something you need to kind of keep an eye on. Talk to your tech team, talk about your specific situation, maybe give them a little bit of background of your area and what you plan to grow and what you see from a storm perspective, and they'll help you pick the amount of bracing and the type of bracing that you may need. Snow loads, this is a great concern of people up north for rightful reasons. Just know that the structural part of the hoop house is meant to give you a time buffer to get out there and remove the snow from the top. One, you're blocking the sun, which is not great for the plants. You're blocking the warmth that the hoop house could be absorbing. So it's very much a maintenance issue. And in this picture, you can see on the right and the left where the hip boards are and the side curtains are, that there is snow built up. If there's going to be snow damage, that is more likely going to be what happens and where the damage occurs. The snow is pushing on the ground post on a saturated piece of ground, and that's more likely to where you're going to get movement. So removing the snow and then having a plan in place to remove the snow from around the foundation is really what you're going to want to look for when it comes to snow loads. Next section, section 5, we're looking at keeping the hoop house cool in the summer. The very first thing, this is in Kansas, Tracy Lutz's farm. So shade cloth is by far the most popular way to help mitigate some of that shade. We do have tape and monofilament, but we're moving more to a monofilament type of shade cloth moving forward. It's significantly stronger. It just holds up way longer. You can keep it a little tighter if you need to be. There's aluminum, there's black, there's white. You'll need it for different reasons at different times and different crops. We've got a very limited amount of time on this webinar, but we just recently put out a very detailed video on the aluminum black and white on YouTube. And we also show you how to install that. And we'll talk a little bit more about YouTube here in just a little bit. So when we're also reducing the heat, the second most popular thing that we see, and if you're a southern grower, it's like almost a must that you have roll-up sides. This one in the top picture on the left also has some insect netting on it to help keep the bugs out after the final completion of the build, but having that roll-up side gives you fresh air intake at the ground level where the plants are, and it kind of helps keep humidity out of there, and it gives you that fresh air exchange that you're looking for. Again, if you're in the southern part of the states, or if you have a heat-sensitive crop or something like that, considering exhaust fans that have power to basically, as the heat rises, before it has a chance to build up and push its way down to the plant levels, you're expelling that heat, And on the opposite end, you're going to have a vent that opens up and draws in fresh air. And even though it's 100 degrees outside, if it's 120 degrees inside of the hoop house, bringing in 100 degrees worth of air versus 120 that you're expelling still gives that plant a cooling effect. But that fresh air exchange is huge for the plants. It's huge for the humidity control, especially on some of the crops that are a little bit more sensitive to it. Down on the far left, this was actually my hoop house, or my greenhouse a long time ago, my tomato greenhouse. That's the only picture I think you'll see a heater in. But those circulation fans that you see on the top right of that picture basically circulate the air so you're not having pockets of heat or cold air build up. So it's that constant churning of the air as you're expelling, bringing in fresh air, either from an intake vent or a roll-up side. It's just one more thing that you can do to kind of help those plants get a little bit more air. And again, we'll go back to the irrigation and having that plan in place, both for overhead and drip. You'll use overhead whenever you're first planting seedlings out and the roots are very small. You need to cover a bigger area. And then as your plants grow, you can switch over to drip as they're growing a little bit wider. Be aware that open pollinated crops may or may not do great inside of a hoop house. They need to get pollinated, while a greenhouse variety, more often than not, especially on fruiting and vining crops, we're looking at self-pollinating F1, non-GMO, with vastly better yields. It's a big, big difference to get a greenhouse variety versus an open pollinated or a non-greenhouse variety that you would get at like a big box store or something like that. We really encourage you to reach out to your seed representatives to get a little bit more information on that as you're doing crop selection. Summer crops, again, if it's summertime, you need to be growing summer crops. If it's wintertime, get rid of those summer crops, switch over to something that can take the cold. Your yields will vastly, vastly increase. Keeping it warm in the winter, the first thing Julian and his team is going to do is, where are you going to sell your product? If you don't have a winter market or a sales strategy in place to get rid of that, why are we investing time into growing? So you may find that if you don't have a market or the season is going to be too rough and you decide that that juice is not going to be worth the squeeze again, that you may furlough the kit or the tunnel, or you may cover crop or build up the soil or something like that. But if you do choose to grow, again, cold weather crops, leafy greens, lettuces, kale, you can decide on broccoli and cabbage if that's right for you, if that needs to go outside under a frost blanket. A lot of people are growing carrots. You'll see kale. You'll see some herbs, not basil or anything like that, but rosemary, seasonal herbs like that. Again, frost blanket is probably the most significant thing you can do past a hoop house to protect those crops in the wintertime. Some people choose to mulch their aisles, and that kind of helps protect the root zone that's actually absorbing the heat throughout the day, slowly releasing it at night. So it's just a little extra layer of insulation. And then this other hoop house, it's also south of us, and they have built a custom end wall on their north side. You can also do that double inflation film that we talked about earlier. And if you choose to do a heater, call up the tech guys. They'll walk you through that process. Just know that you'll have to have power, gas, propane to it, and it's just more of an expense that may or may not be worth it, depending on your operation, depending on if you have a market for it and what the crops are. Most people, once they find out that the crops aren't going to need that big boost of heat, typically don't even wind up going with it. Sizing the hoop house. This is one of our 30-footers, so you can see it's quite tall. It has a lot of air mass. And as you're sizing, beyond considering the amount of space that you have inside of your land or your lot, whatever the case may be, there's also the sizing of the beds. So I really want you to select your crops before you do anything else, because that is going to determine or help you determine the size of your hoop house and the number of beds and the spacing of the beds. So a little bit of spacing changes could give you a little bit more square footage to grow in. Both of these pictures are up in Meriden, Kansas, and this is right in the middle of winter on both of those, so you can see it's a nice full house of lettuce and kale. Graph paper is your best friend at this planting stage. The bottom picture is a 10-foot wide hoop house in Florida. This guy specialized in ornamental, like specialty houseplants. And this hoop house on the top right is about 40 minutes from us in Paris, Texas. It's that same 30-footer you saw a minute ago. You can see the amount of space. So if you're not locked into a sizing restriction, playing around with those crop selections, playing around with graph paper. Not to say that every square inch of that is going to be grown in. A lot of people use that for a little bit of storage, and that's also something you need to consider. Are you going to harvest? Are you going to store things in there? Work that into it. Be mindful of shade, especially from trees, tall bushes, other buildings if you're in an urban setting. Utility and street easements. I have seen a couple of times where somebody's built something too close to the property line. The street has been widened and they had an issue. Hopefully you're not dealing with HOA restrictions or anything like that, but be mindful of it. And even if you don't have the HOA, if you're next to one, who knows what could happen. So do your due diligence. If you add utilities, so if we're talking about if you want to add some power out there, you need to run a water line, that additional expense, I don't want you to be surprised about in your planning. And also door placements. I've seen some folks like put the door way far away than what they could have. And every single day they're walking a few extra 100 feet. So as you're selecting your site, just be aware that a door on both ends may save you a lot of walking throughout the course of your grow. Think about your market. Think about your personal capabilities. Do you have room to grow as your market expands? And remember that about 30% of the cost of a hoop house is tied up in the end walls. So we're talking about the doors. We're talking about the flat piece that makes up the end. So building two 20 by 20s versus one 20 by 40 is going to cost you considerable more than if you just built a longer hoop house, if you have the room. And I know that that's a big issue. So if you have some questions, again, for the tech team, but not once have I ever called, or has anybody ever called, or I've talked to somebody and said that they wanted a smaller hoop house. Again, hopefully you're going to be great at this. Your market's going to grow. Your demand's going to grow. More often than not, most people that we talk to are actually building a second, third, fourth, and in the case of some of our growers, 10, 11, 12 hoop houses. So make sure that you're really thinking about, do you have room to trial out new product? Do you have room to move around in? And hopefully you'll size that right the first time. So I'm not going to get too far into this. A little bit before this webinar started, you were sent an email that kind of walks you through a lot of these next few slides. So we have around the Gothic, the DIY, and the Caterpillar tunnel. In that document, we do have all the links and all the widths that's available. We can custom do the links. So if you want 65, so we sell in 20, 40, 60, 80, 100, and 150. But if you need a 120, if you need a 90, just let us know and we'll walk you through that and adjust that during the custom bid. And we do have new kits and sizes coming out in late 2024 that we're currently putting together now. Apples to apples bids. This is hugely important as you're calling other companies and get a bid. There's no national standard. So because every manufacturer is different, our expertise and our knowledge was based, a lot of this design was based on my past farming and what I've seen and requests from our customers that we deal with a lot. And for some of these companies that are 20, 30, 40 years old, they kind of said it once and they haven't looked at it. And there's some very unique stuff out there. But because there's no national standard, we all do things a little bit different. So thinking about all of the items and all the customization in that document that we sent, there's a full page that gives you questions to ask other bidders. That way it's almost never going to be apples to apples, but hopefully some of those questions that you'll be able to ask will help you kind of decide which one may be better for you or not, or if there's another option once you talk to the tech folks. The little document on the right, there's 3 different bid sheets in that document that we sent you. That's basically everything that our tech team is going to ask you as we go through and kind of help you pick out your hoop house. But that's also something that you could take to other companies and go, what purlings does this come with? What's the gauge of the metal? Where are you sourcing the metal from? Where's this made? All that's a big deal. Making sure you don't forget your repair tape and take a look at all those options. So that's there. Also, these 2 pictures on the right, that's how your hoop house from us is going to come by and large. So that crate that you see right there is going to get shipped and delivered to you. We have 2 videos also on YouTube that walk you through the whole delivery process, how that works, how to unload it, and all that stuff, so we don't have to take up the time here. The install process, I tried to break this down in the most simple form possible. The great thing about all of our kits is you can download the instructions or view them on your phone. So during the build, you can send that link to everybody that's helping you. That way you're literally on the same page. We also send a nice book with the kits, but going through here before and walking through that build process with the tech team, if you have any questions, it's a great way to kind of know what you're getting yourself into. Also, on all of the major components, we have a QR code that you can scan with your phone, and it'll take you exactly to a video in which we talk about the installation process and the concepts around some of those installation parts. I've broke this down into basically 6 categories. 1, squaring and setting the ground post. 2, putting together and installing the hoops into the ground post. 3, your ridge pole and purlins, which basically connect all of those hoops and kind of give it that structural integrity from the top. 4, your hip and baseboard installation, which connects it anywhere from 3 to 6 foot up off the ground for your sidewalls or for extra bracing. And then your baseboard that kind of connects all the ground posts together. 5, your end walls and door components. And 6, the plastic. And all of those options that we've talked about before that you see on the right, a lot of that's going to happen between the 3rd and the 5th step. And inside of those instruction manuals, you'll see when to do certain components of that. And again, the 2 pictures on the right, that's the top one is in northern Arizona. Bottom one is Whispering Willows Flower Hoop House in Arkansas. How to save $500 to $1,000. Again, we keep talking about calling the tech team. I want to break down what all happens with a hoop house. So the DIY hoop house is called $1,600. So I'm predicating all this on a 20 by 100 with a little asterisk because there's a little difference in the 30-foot all metal because there is a significant price break. So starting at the top with the 30-foot all metal, $20,000. There's so much more steel in that compared to our 14 and 20 footers that you'll see all metal Gothic and all metal round. And the price difference between the Gothic and the round, again, has to do with the amount of metal that's going inside of the hoops. The Gothics tend to be a little taller, and there's a little bit more bracing involved in that. The Caterpillar tunnels, it's a pretty significant drop. The ground posts are sized differently, and you don't have the hip and baseboard, but you do have integrated sidewalls. So giving the DIY, at the very bottom, that's a low price point. That's the most economical way to get into that because you're not having to pay for the shipping of the lumber for the hip, baseboards, and end walls. And it's also, you're buying the poles locally and bending them with a hoop bender. So what you get with that kit is all the connecting hardware, the lock channel, the spring wire, anything that you typically cannot get at a regular big box or hardware store, plus the plastic. If we then switch over to what the options look like, this gives you an idea of what, again, for the 20 foot by 100 foot, if I had to like make things equal across the board, this is the price for that size of a kit. So if you get a smaller one, these prices are going to change. But I wanted to give you just an idea of, purlins is the most expensive upgrade that you can do, but they're included in some of the kits already. So that's why I want you to call and talk to the tech team. You may not even have to worry about that $1,300. They may talk to you and say, hey, on a 14-foot hoop house that's, doesn't have a lot of wind exposure or a lot of snow, you're not going to need that. We're not going to sell you something when you don't need. And we're going to ask you a lot of questions because we want you to be happy. We want you to know that you can come to us and get a great answer. How to save the money, getting that custom bid. We can work directly with you on the shipping costs. So my for instance is, let's say you got excited from this webinar and you went to our website and you're in Oklahoma, a few hours away from us, and you ordered straight off the website. We have to make sure that the shipping is included in this, which means we have to kind of account for shipping all across the states. But if you call us up and say, hey, Julie and Simon, I'm in Oklahoma, can I come pick this up? Absolutely, we can back that shipping off of there. Hey, we want to add all these options. Great, we can bundle that up. We don't have to have shipping on each one of those individual options versus, hey, I want to add this on later. Can you ship it to me separate? Of course it's going to be more. And again, we want to make sure that you don't get greenhouse envy from stuff you see from anybody else that you may or may not need. And again, sizing that correctly, saving that 30% from the in-wall cost is going to save you, maybe not on the first kit, but for sure on the second kit if you wind up not having to build one because you built a little bit bigger. It's almost always cheaper to do that. We're in Paris, Texas, so if you're within, whatever drive you're comfortable in doing, and you have a truck or trailer or want to rent a U-Haul to come pick that up, we can save you even more, and the tech team will take care of you off of that. YouTube, we have, I don't know how many videos we got on all of these subjects and more. Hoop House 101 series, both of these links are inside of that document that was sent to you earlier. So the Hoop House 101 basically walks you step by step through the build process that you would see in any of the instruction manuals. The 201 series gets into some specialty cases, how to unload from the truck, things like that, and just things that you would find in advice that you would need outside of those instruction manuals. We also have different growing tips. There's a series on how to grow tomatoes and trellis tomatoes. There's a ton of stuff on YouTube. We have videos coming out weekly. We're always adding to that, so give us a follow there and kind of keep up. And if you're in one of those and have questions, hey, I'm the one that kind of takes care of those questions, but happy to answer them for you. This is the picture that is in that PDF that you get. So that's how to get a hold of the tech line. The tech line answers the phone calls Monday through Friday, but not once ever has somebody called on a Sunday and not been able to get an answer. Customer service that picks up. If they can't answer it, they'll call me, they'll call Julian directly. We'll get a hold of you. We know that you're building this on the weekend. That's why we answer the phone 7 days a week. We're not going to leave you hanging. So that's how to get a hold of us. That's our YouTube, that's our instructions, and all the links that you're going to need for those kind of things. 46 minutes, minute over. So now we got time for Q&A. So Julian, I'm going to have you pop in and hit me with what you got.
All right, I'm here. So first one I want to address is Denise in Seguin, Texas. So, one of the biggest misconceptions about a greenhouse is that it keeps water off your plants, but plants need water to live. So, one thing I was looking at, you're in Seguin, Texas, just a little history about Texas. When it rains and it pours. And we have the same weather. I live in North Texas. So, some of those plants you put out as seedlings, we could have a week where you get rain for 3 days straight and it pours and it doesn't stop. And a hoop house prevents those seedlings you planted from essentially drowning. So definitely a good add-on. I would definitely put end walls on it. You don't want that wind and rain blowing in. You want to be able to control that environment. And the aluminum shade is going to be a big benefit in the fact that, one, it's 50%. It has a mylar material woven into it. It reflects a lot of UV light. And then, of course, being 50%, it's going to reduce the amount of UV light getting in and help to reduce the temperature. One of the things I put in the chat for everybody was talking about shade, and that is, if you're standing under shade, the temperature outside doesn't change, the temperature doesn't get cooler, you're just not feeling the sun hitting you or the UV light. So the same thing for your plants. Well, it will reduce the temperature in your hoop house, but it's not going to make it cooler. So your hoop house will never be cooler than what the outside temperature is. So if it's 95 outside, unless you're doing something as far as some type of evaporative cooling, whether it's misters or an evaporator cooler or a wet wall, you're not going to reduce the temperature in your hoop house less than what the outdoor temperature is.
If you're outside working and you get under a tree, you automatically feel that. A plant's no different. I mean, a plant wants to be comfortable. So if you're comfortable, the plant's going to be more comfortable. So if you're adding that shade cloth, not only is it great for the plants because they get a break from that direct sunlight, but it's also great for you as the farm operator, for your workers. You're getting more bang for your buck from your labor dollars. So picking the right shade cloth, again, that's something that you'll have to get into with the tech team when we have more time. But just giving your plants a break from that direct sun all day long is the biggest benefit to that. Reducing the temperature, it does a little bit, but I don't hang my hat on that. It's all about the comfort level for the plants and giving them the best growing environment.
The next one I'll address is from Mark. You had a question about a building permit. So normally if you live in the county, it's not required. If you live within city limits, some cities require a building permit for it. Um, there is the IBC International Building Code. Every city goes off of that, but uh, a lot of building officials work on homes, commercial buildings, things of that nature all the time, and they're very familiar with with spans and roofing materials and the type of building materials you can use for homes and commercial buildings and all that. But when it comes to a greenhouse, they're not real sure. So 3 years ago, they created Chapter 31, which is membrane covered structures. And a lot of building officials aren't very familiar with it because it's fairly new. Or a lot of cities may currently still be operating off of, say, 2019's IBC or 2020's. They haven't adopted the newest because they have to pay and get licensing to use the newest version. But what I would tell you is, yes, a building code can be required in certain cases, but in most cases, if it's a membrane covered structure and it's because it's an uninhabited structure, nobody actually lives inside of it. It normally doesn't fall under having to be permitted unless the city that you live in has actually created an ordinance or they chose to delete that, because cities can choose to accept different parts of the IBC. So if they chose to exempt themselves from Chapter 31, it may fall under an accessory structure, and they may require something different from you to actually be able to permit it.
And look, this is one of the good benefits to having somebody like Julian and the tech team involved is if you're dealing with a city official, they're people. I mean, they're just trying to get through their day, right? And there's no way that they can know everything either. So if they wind up giving you a little bit of pushback, just ask them, look, do you mind talking to our tech team? And Julian can basically walk them through the same thing that he just said here, which is the same thing that he's talked to other building officials in other municipalities, may be able to show case studies in which, like, let's say it's a neighboring town or a neighboring state. It's like, look, ran into the same things, no problem. Julian can say what he just said, give an example. They may review it. They may have to put it in front of a board or something like that and get a variance. Before Julian came, the only state or the only city I really had a trouble in was Denver. But this is right during the cannabis area, and then they didn't want any more greenhouses, right? So they made it super tough. But more often than not, after talking to Julian and the tech team, we talk to these people on a human level, respectful level, and kind of be like, yep, we understand, we hear what you're saying, but have you also looked at this code or that code or the membrane? There's no way they can keep up on it. So that's one of the services we can give you guys.
The next thing, Jed, you had a question about solar powered options for fans and coolers. It will cost a lot of money for that. I have seen advertised fans, Amazon, a couple companies that advertise them. You will need to spend quite a bit of money to get something equivalent to what plugs into a 110 outlet. I'm not saying it can't be done, but when it comes down to it, you'll need solar panels, you'll need a charge controller to charge batteries, you'll need an inverter. Every time I add one of those devices, you're looking at several $100s to have a competent system that you're not going to have to worry about, that will operate and produce the amount of CFM you need to actually ventilate or cool and operate a large enough fan to actually do the work that you need necessary. Jed, you also had a question about shade cloth, inside or outside. What I'll tell you is, if you hang shade cloth on the inside, flat across the inside, what'll happen is you'll create a hot space above the shade cloth. And if it's not ventilated, it'll stratify. All the heat will go up above that shade cloth and stay there. So it's definitely better to put on the outside. Now, a lot of commercial greenhouses, big gutter connect greenhouses, you'll see them on the inside, but the benefit that they have, normally they'll have some type of hard glazing, and they'll normally have a ridge vent where they can open up the whole top, and that heat that's stratifying is going to go through the shade cloth and straight up out through the roof. In a high tunnel situation, we don't have that. You can create cross flow, but it's going to take more to get that out if you have shade on the inside.
And I will say, and this comes from, I'm very fortunate to have gone to so many different hoop houses and actual, structurally engineered greenhouses for monocrops across the country. You'll see a lot of times, especially like if you get to looking at shade cloth, and sometimes you'll see videos of these mechanical situations where it does deploy shade cloth vertically exactly the way Julian talked about. It's almost always in one of those big hoop houses that have those huge ridge vents. So again, don't fall in love with something just because you've seen it out there. Let's look at this from a practical perspective, keeping that shade out instead of trapping it in a structure that's vastly different than what you're trying to deploy that shade cloth in. That's something to think about.
Michael Bozart, do we support movable tunnels? I will tell you, in the last 4 years, I have never talked to anyone that's moved one. Most cat tunnels that have been rebuilt, I know people buy them to move them, but the amount of labor it takes to put one up, normally, especially a larger one, something larger than a cat tunnel, I very rarely hear people doing that. Now, low tunnels, that's a completely different story. Those get moved all the time. They'll get moved from one row to the next or one field to the next for a different crop. But I hardly ever talk to anyone who's moved one. Now, I know people that have bought them used and moved them to their property, but I don't know anyone that realistically plants out a greenhouse and then moves it, or plants it out and moves it somewhere else to replant.
I'll cover one from Jed Littlefield. And Jed, thank you for saying what you did about your hoop house surviving those 75-mile winds up in Idaho. We have a ton of hoop houses in Idaho, and one of the states I haven't been to, so I need to get up there. But what about natural pollinators when I use the screens? And I'm assuming we're talking about the insect nettings, keeping the pollinators out. Is there a good way to pollinate tomatoes, cucumbers, and such? So we're talking about fruiting crops, especially on a vine. Again, those F1 pollination, those F1 varieties, the greenhouse varieties, they are self-pollinating. That's why you also want to use like circulation fans, but I'll tell you, so I only had F1s in mine. I did grow year-round in Texas tomatoes, so I've got a lot of experience with tomatoes, particularly in Dutch buckets and in-ground growing trellised up. The amount of pruning that you're doing is shaking those so much, and because they're self-pollinating. If you're choosing the right varieties, you don't have to worry about the pollinators. But if you do select another variety outside of a hoop house for hopefully a very specific reason, there is companies that will sell you bee boxes and things like that you can have shipped in on a regular basis or however long you need. And you would have to talk to them. I've never personally done that. I know it's out there. You just have to type in bee box and see what's regional or sometimes national to you. But by and large, greenhouse varieties, you don't have to worry about the pollination of those fruiting crops.
Also, if you look at the performance of a wood bee versus a regular honeybee, they do about 50 times more work a single wood bee versus a honeybee.
So Elizabeth Williams Dixon, if I'm in a hot climate, should I look at a high tunnel? Talking about the NRCS EQUIP grant, which we have a crazy amount of resources on there. You can take a look, but should she consider a big screen instead of plastic? That's outside of the scope of the NRCS grant for the High Tunnel Initiative. Not saying that they don't have another grant or regional grant that you may have to ask your agent about. There is some shade cloth stuff coming out, but it's a different grant other than the High Tunnel Initiative. I'm not currently up to date right this second on the screens. I think Julian's a little bit more on that, but it does fall out of the spec of probably the grant that we're talking about here. Any experience with scissor door end walls? I don't. If I did, I'd tell you. I've never been to a farm that had them, so I'm not going to tell you something I don't know. Have you seen advantages for fruit tree production in high tunnels? Again, for my whole reason for being here and for doing the job that I do is to service the market gardeners that are out there. Do people do fruit trees in high tunnels? I am not a fruit tree expert. I do know that certain fruit trees need a certain amount of chill hours, that they have to maintain a certain number of chill days and chill hours to actually produce the fruit, which is counterproductive inside of a high tunnel. That's kind of why I put that slide in there about that that hoop house in Nebraska that's doing citrus, that's great for an experiment. It's an old video. I would love to see it still in operation today. I don't know if it's happening, but if I would really consult with a fruit tree expert, that's not me, to see if that's something you may need to do. But we live in an area in North Texas that does a ton of peaches, and they have different ways of keeping the frost off of that via irrigation, via big heat blowers and things like that. But berries like strawberries, that's one thing. But rarely do I see blueberries. For sure don't see grapes. Fruit trees, I just don't see the volume of fruit that would come out of the real estate inside of that, and to make that worthwhile. And there's a second part about permaculture and food forest. Again, that's not my area of expertise. I know there's way more people are way more knowledgeable in that whole incorporation of trees and the grasses and the foraging and all of that combined. So I really can't speak on that. But if that's what you want to do and that's where your passion is, and you may or may not have to make a living at it, it's, hey, I'm never going to tell anybody that they can't do it. I just don't have the knowledge to sit here and go, yes, this fruit tree in this zone is going to give you this amount of fruit. I just don't see it in all my travels. We're looking, think about, and I'm going to go back to that cabbage example, right? So cabbage takes quite a while to grow out versus, a 45-day head of lettuce that you can do several more turns a season. So let's say we can sell a cabbage for, whatever, let's just say $5. Let's shoot for the moon. You're selling a head of cabbage for $5 that's taking up the space of what 4 to 6 heads of lettuce, depending on the variety, is, and you're able to sell 3 rounds of that versus 1 round of cabbage for an equal amount. You're making way more money on lettuce or kale or other cut greens versus that big head of cabbage. So think about the amount of turns you can do. Think about the varieties that you can squeeze in. Think about adding herbs or cut flowers, which is a higher value crop, to really get that thing paid for. Okay, Phil, recently bought a shade cloth, having some arthritis issues. I feel you on that one. Having a hard time with the black plastic connectors to tie down. I personally like spring wire over those. You pretty much already have spring wire. It doesn't take a whole lot. We kind of covered that in that YouTube video that we just had. I know that sometimes on those connectors they get just a little askew, a little off, and sometimes those teeth touch each other, so that it's hard to describe verbally. But that little saddle that makes up that plastic, I have had a better time taking that and shifting it between my index and thumb and just shifting that over so it kind of goes into place, and then squeezing it down. With arthritis issues, maybe a small piece of small pliers with you to kind of give you a little bit of force. Don't squeeze it too much now, but shifting that over in the saddle part of it, and hopefully having a little bit of mechanical advantage. Hopefully that helps.
I'll address the next one, Nick. The round high tunnels are wind rated to 110 miles an hour. One thing we talked about earlier was wind is usually not what destroys a hoop house. It's the flying debris. So if you've ever seen a trampoline leave someone's backyard when the wind hits 50 or 60, or you've seen patio furniture, large grills and stuff knocked over, patio furniture blown off or blown into a swimming pool. Shingles are designed to come off of your roof at 65 to 70 so that the wind can pull them off and it doesn't pull the plywood off of your home. So think about once you hit 70, you've got a lot of flying debris, whether it's sticks, shingles, hubcaps, whatever's in your yard or your neighbor's yard. Those things can puncture the plastic fairly easily. Normally, it doesn't take out the main or the steel part of the structure, the hoops and other things. But if it makes a hole and that hole continues to get larger and the wind gets inside and that plastic starts flapping, you can lose all the plastic. There are upgraded plastics like woven plastic that comes in an 8 mil or an 11 mil. They're a little bit more difficult to work with, but they also if they get a tear in them, the tear won't continue because it's a woven material. So there's things you can use to mitigate high wind if you know there's debris or things around you or something that could potentially puncture it. Ice or snow load. As far as ice and snow, we consider those to be a maintenance item. If you know you're going to get weather, some type of inclement, and you live in an area that gets wet snow, you're gonna have to get up and get that snow off of the hoop house, whether that's before you go to bed or first thing in the morning when you get up. If you live in eastern Michigan and you get lake effect snow that's wet and heavy and sticky, you're gonna have to manage it. You can't leave it for a week on a farm that you don't live at and expect it to survive. The plastic traditionally tends to hold up to the snow. What happens is you get so much weight on it that it actually crushes the metal structure. Now, you go with something like a Gothic style where you have a peak on it and you've got a pitch on the roof, and it's designed for snow to shed off of it. That's going to be more beneficial in an area that gets a large amount of snow, and that you get wet snow.
Also, Marie, Tracy Lutz is in the chat, dear friend of ours, worked with him a lot. He's got a channel on YouTube called Kansas City Garden Guy. If I read this right, you're in Kansas City, Missouri. We spend a lot of time up there. He's not that far from you. And he's got videos going back the last 2 or 3 years with our structures. So you can kind of see what he's done the last 3 years and kind of get an idea of how he's handling the snow and the storms and things like that. So, and Julian, thanks for bringing up the wet snow, dry snow. That's one question when we see, hey, can it take snow? Well, what kind of snow? It's all different. So it's great. Great information there. So we're pretty much out of time here. I'm going to go back through the chat. We're going to put a video version of this out, I believe on Sunday, a replay of this video kind of thing. If we missed any of these questions, I'll cover it at the end of that. Also, if you just have to know, tomorrow, give Julian a call. He'll be able to answer that. But this webinar didn't happen just the two of us. We have a whole team of people that helps us on the media side, and we thank every single one of them. Thanks to the owners of the company who let us do all these fun things, and all of our customer service people. So we work with a great group of people. We all love each other, and we're just happy to serve the people that we're served. And thanks for showing and spending your time with us over this last hour and 15 minutes. It's a big deal to show up and do stuff, and we sure appreciate it. Other than that, we'll see you on the tech line. We'll see you in the comment sections, whatever the case may be, and we'll answer stuff in the fastest manner as possible. And hey, thanks for showing up, and we'll have some more.